A little plug for my organization first, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. This office is the global leader in the fight against drugs and international crime. It also has the honor of being the Secretariat and Guardian of the UN Convention Against Corruption. We are mandated, the UN, to assist member states in their attempts to address issues of drugs, crime, and terrorism. And there are three pillars to our work. Number one, field-based technical cooperation to enhance the capacity of each individual member state, to research and analyze the work that has been carried out to increase the general knowledge and awareness of all member states in relation to these very important areas. And finally, it's the normative work we do to assist states in the ratification and implementation of the convention, which is equally important, of course. That's the plug over, so now I can go back to what I hopefully know a little bit about. In terms of challenges in combating corruption, I would say that the first challenge every state has is to address the will to address corruption. It is a very difficult and sensitive area, and no doubt, for many reasons, it may not necessarily be easy for any state to take the step of saying we need to make progress on corruption. It tends to show perhaps that there is a problem. It tends to perhaps show a negative aspect of a state. Despite that, there is a very good saying, which is where there is a will, there is a way. In the absence of it, there is no way. So, first of all, I think it is a matter to be applauded that so many member states, over 160 now, have come to the point of ratification. This, for me, means that they have taken seriously their own obligations to address corruption. That is the very first step on the way to progress. In terms of following on, however, I will steal perhaps a little bit from my friend and delegate, Mr. Kiyono. That will does not end with the simple ratification of a convention. It never should end with the ratification of the convention. The will extends to making sure that the words which are written on a piece of paper, which is the UN Convention Against Corruption, are given life in every single state. That is not to say that they have to be given the same form in every single state. That's not possible. We all have our own individual issues, our own individual ways of doing things, and that again is to be celebrated. However, it does mean it needs to be followed up and followed through into what we do. A second challenge is resources. Many countries have many different challenges when it comes to resources. There are the least developed countries which simply do not have the resources. For those, it is incumbent upon the donor agencies and the donors, the more wealthy countries, to come forward, to step forward, and to provide the assistance that's required to develop those countries. Without it, we are ignoring the ability for those states to be able to address the problems themselves. There are countries which perhaps have a little bit more income, are able to address these issues, but at the same time, they have to distribute those assets over very many other issues. In that situation, it is, I think, the responsibility first and foremost of the state to think about how it resources the issue of corruption, and secondly, for others to see if they can support it in a way which will assist those states. In saying this, the one thing I would say is that when it comes to corruption and addressing corruption, the reward will come very soon after you put the resources in. And in terms of those resources, I do not simply mean in enforcement, although that is an important element. I mean resources holistically put throughout the system to make sure you can address corruption. That means you have to resource the police to investigate. That means you have to resource the prosecutors to be able to carry out a prosecution. That means you have to be able to resource the judiciary to make sure that the judiciary can carry out its function without the threat from organized crimes, organized criminals, and from wider people who have sufficient monies, if they need to take out people that are obstructing them. And in Afghanistan, for example, there are very many situations where prosecutors were executed, literally, because they were simply doing their job. Similarly with investigators, similarly with the judiciary. So there, in terms of resources, there is a need to make sure there is protection for those that will take on this area of work, and that there is a need to make sure there are enough of them to carry out the work in the scale required for whichever state is looking at it. And only the state itself can measure this in terms of how they do it. But it does need to be done. Another issue which was touched upon was the legal framework. Another challenge for many states will be to make sure that their legal framework is fit for purpose. And by fit for purpose, I mean you address the issues of how to tackle bribery, how to tackle not only the receipt of a bribe by a public official, but those who make the bribes, how to tackle bribery in the public sector, how to deal with witness protection, how to deal with procurement. All of these things are the legal framework which will be underpinning your ability as a state to work on corruption. If there are gaps in this, then there are gaps in your ability to tackle corruption. It is as simple as that. And in that sense, that is another challenge that every state has. Systemic weakness. By systemic weakness, I'm talking very much about perhaps something I've already touched upon. Every single element of a state system which is addressing corruption needs to be protected. It needs to be protected to the extent that it cannot be got at. I come very much from an enforcement background, so you'll have to bear with me if I lean towards enforcement, which is the way with enforcement people, unfortunately. But if you're going to say that you want to tackle corruption, what you need first and foremost is a clean system and a quick system. By a clean system, what I mean is uncorrupt police investigation, uncorrupt prosecutors, and uncorrupt judiciary. That's a challenge. It's a massive challenge, especially when you're dealing with all the other challenges around you. But whether you do it through a specific measure with a small group, or whether you do it on a wider level, you need to make sure you have a clean system. And you have to address that. Once you've done that, then you have to be able to go through and say, where are the other elements where I can actually provide that element of cleanliness, that we can make sure we have at least some element of certainty that we can make any investigation or prosecution work effectively. Otherwise, what you're going to find, and many states have found this, is that you're trying to, how shall I put it? You're trying to you're swimming through dirty water and expecting to be clean at the other side. It's just not going to happen. In terms of enforcement capacity, I've already touched on it. I think that's always a challenge, but again, it's an important one. Technology, this is a new one. I think technology for corruption is both a boon and a hindrance. It's a boon in the sense of you can increase the capacity of investigators to work because you have new special techniques using technology, but at the same time, criminals, organized criminals, those who are corrupt, will use the same technology to prevent the gathering of evidence. And again, this is why a state that is trying to address this needs to be able to have a very firm intelligence foundation in terms of what it is and how corruption is taking place in that state, because then it can decide the level of technology it needs to invest in, or indeed the level of technology it needs to prevent operating in order to make sure that it can identify the evidence that's required. The final challenge from my perspective is the international elements of criminality. Everyone has touched upon this, and they are right to touch upon it. The world is getting smaller. Unfortunately, the world is getting smaller for criminals faster than it is for the enforcement side the work that we do. Criminals now don't have to respect borders. They can move money anywhere they want. They can use it through transfers via banks, etc., etc. 2 seconds, the money's gone. How are you going to get it back? How are you going to make sure that the money that's taken from any state, embezzled, whatever, it could be millions, it could be billions. How are you going to get that money back? You may be able to get that person into prison, you may be able to bring a prosecution, but if you don't bring the money back to the place where it can do some good, you have what we would call a Pyrrhic victory. It's a victory in name, but you don't necessarily have what you wanted in the first place, namely the use of funds for where it belongs, to help those that need it. So in that sense, there are tools that you need to be able to develop to a capacity that you can chase money quickly, whether it's the money or the individual, should I say, and ensure that those matters are addressed in a relatively quick way for your own state. It's a very easy statement, I appreciate, and I fully appreciate that it's not so easy in the real world, but in terms of how you do it, you need to look at things like mutual legal assistance treaties, bilateral treaties, multilateral treaties, using UNCAC as a treaty if you need to for these sorts of offenses. In terms of money laundering, again, using technology, having fantastic and very good financial investigation capacity within your own state to do these things. Without it, you haven't got a hope in hell. You really don't. If you don't have financial investigators who know what they're doing, if you don't have the capacity to actually trace money from where it is in your own country or state to another place, you're wasting your time again. So again, this is something that you do need to look at in terms of challenging corruption at any scale whatsoever. So, the role of UNCAC. Many people have already touched upon it, and I thank them for it because it means I don't have to speak so much. I'm going to be very brief. It's about 10-15 years to get to where we are, from a point where very little was known about corruption. And again, the very fact that we are all here talking about it is a statement to be applauded in terms of the fact that we know so much about corruption now. The next step is, of course, addressing it properly. In terms of the purpose of the UN Convention Against Corruption, may I refer you respectfully to Article 1 of that convention, where you will see that there are 3 main purposes of this convention. First, to promote and strengthen measures to prevent and combat corruption more effectively and efficiently. Second, to promote, facilitate and support international cooperation and technical assistance in the prevention of the fight against corruption, including in asset recovery. And third, to promote integrity, accountability and proper management of public affairs and public property. Another plug for the UNODC here. If you go to their website and click on corruption, you will find that there is a whole wealth of information freely available to anyone who wants to look at the tools that are available from the UNODC in terms of tackling corruption, including the full wording of the convention and of all the implementation review working groups which have been touched upon as well. In summary, there are 4 main pillars of UNCAC. One is prevention, one is criminalization, one is international cooperation, and of course asset recovery. So those 4 main pillars, and you will find a great deal of information within each one of those about the areas you need to address. Taken as a whole, UNCAC therefore, I would suggest, provides a very comprehensive framework for any state seriously looking at trying to tackle corruption in terms of what they need to do and what they need to implement within their laws and systems to make sure corruption is eradicated or minimized within their state. The next step on from that was, of course, the review mechanism, and that's a fairly new thing. It's a peer review mechanism. First and foremost, it is not intended to be a finger-pointing exercise. It is not intended to be a critique of any state. It is supposed to be there as a tool so that every state can learn from other states, so that every state can understand the difficulties that are posed and found in every state possible, whether it's rich or poor, and to learn from that experience. It is very much about trying to make sure every state has the access to the full wealth of information from 167 odd countries in terms of how they have tackled the same issues. If it is taken as that, I would suggest that this, in the future, will be the very foundation of trying to reduce corruption in every single ratified country state. Because you will have not only your own